With us right now, Jason Gillikin. Jason, you're the founder CEO of Earfluence, found on the web at earfluence.com. That's EARfluence.com. You could spell the rest. Jason, thanks so much for joining us.
Josh, I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, we're going to talk about podcasting. So not to get too meta here, but thank you to our listener for listening to a podcast about podcasting. but Jason, I really am excited to kind of get your, kind of your state of the union on, where we are in podcasting right now, where the opportunities are. Obviously I think, there's been some maturation in the platform. I started my first podcast back in 2007. It was March 2007. I was hand coding my own RSS feeds from my radio segment. Started my first official podcast about 8 years ago. So I love the platform. And I'm just such a raving fan. Tell me your podcast conversion story.
I felt like I was early, but it was way later than you. I mean, that is impressive, Josh. So
I had no idea what I was doing, honestly.
But that's the thing. You were early and you figured it out, right? Mm-hmm. And that's one of our mantras is just press record, because you just want to figure out what you have. But my podcasting journey, so 2017. I just really started falling in love with podcasting in general. So how I built this was a huge influence on what I wanted to do. And I could see, so I'd been in my B2B digital marketing job for the past 12 years. And I started to get a little antsy, started listening to these podcasts. And I was like, listen, I can create a podcast here on my own. And I'll interview our clients. So it'll be like how I built this, but for our clients. And we did e-commerce solutions. So how they built their e-commerce companies. And we did that. So we did 10 episodes and it was just me, doing the hosting, producing, editing, all that. Loved it. So the company I was working for didn't really share my vision for how podcasting could be valuable for businesses. I saw that, and it was just kind of time to move on. I've been in that company for way too long. And so I set out on my own to produce podcasts for other companies. Now, meanwhile, I had convinced my wife, while I was still working at that company, convinced my wife to start a podcast. She's like, no. I don't even listen to podcasts. No, she's a wedding planner. Mm-hmm. And I was like, look, you have so many great stories to tell. This would be amazing for a podcast. And that's one of the things that I really loved is just the storytelling part of it. So she's like, okay, fine. If you'll stop bugging me, I'll start a podcast, see what this is. Well, she is actually at episode 140 now of her podcast. It's called Weddings for Real. And it has completely transformed her from wedding planner to industry thought leader, educator, speaker. Like, she is the go-to person for when somebody needs industry knowledge or coaching to be a wedding planner or a wedding pro in general. And so I started to see that develop, right? Like building up her personal brand and what she could do. And so I set on my own, sold a podcast concept to a funeral home, which we can talk about. Then sold a podcast concept to the DPAC, which is a performing arts center here. So the Durham Performing Arts Center. And then partnered with a marketing person. And, we've just, Earfluence has grown so much in the past couple of years because podcasting can be so valuable to build up a company's or a person's brand. And I absolutely love it.
Yeah. So let's talk about kind of the business justification. So if someone's looking at making the investment in starting a podcast, how can they ROI this activity?
Oh, man, it's such a great question. And, everybody wants to think about download numbers initially, and you can't really look at that. Like, so you were one of the originals in 2007. How many podcasts were there at that time?
Yeah, well, and that's the thing, right? Is that, there were very few. But even when, kind of the Savings Angel show is kind of my first kind of official podcast. it was nothing to get 1,000 downloads a day, easily.
Mm-hmm.
That was a very, very typical day. We don't get those download numbers today.
Right.
And that's okay, right? Because to build an audience, it's a grind. It just takes, like it does on YouTube or anywhere else. So that's nothing new. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to start answering the question, Jason. I'll let you.
No, man, you're absolutely right. So, there's 2.4 million podcasts out there right now, or however many there are. And it's really difficult for people to change up their habits. Like they want to listen to Dax Shepard. They want to listen to Brene Brown. They want to listen to Bill Simmons. They want to listen to these bigger names. And it's hard for them to say, you know what, with this 30 minutes or an hour of my time, I'm going to switch that up and try this new podcast out. So it's tough. So how do you justify that for businesses? So there's a lot of different ways to do that. One is, it is one of the best parts of podcasting, which I didn't quite realize in the beginning, is how valuable it is for networking. When somebody says, do you want to be on my podcast? It's so much easier than saying, do you want a sales call with me? And you can get such great information. I liken it to podcasts are like the new golf, right? You can instead of saying, do you want to go out for golf with me? It's, do you want to be on my podcast?
Mm-hmm.
One of our clients, they simply, and this is before their podcast even launched, they simply said, do you want to be on my podcast, to a prospective client, and they got a $30,000 piece of business from that. And so that justifies that ROI so fast for them.
Sure.
So networking is amazing. That business development piece, people will vet you if you have a podcast, and you can get a better sense of who you are and what you can sell to them. So, one of our services now is we get guests on other people's podcasts, right? And that way they can use other audiences to leverage their personal brand, of course. But what they can do then is people that are thinking of buying from them can hear their message. Same thing with having your own podcast. People that are thinking of buying from them be like, oh, let me check this podcast out because I want to see, am I comfortable buying from this person? And if I am, then yes, let me go forward with this. And they get a better sense of your personality. And then one more I'll add, and then I'll kind of hush and let you, ask some more questions. I just kind of ramble on sometimes, Josh, but content production. So when you're doing a podcast, all of a sudden you have so much great content that you can leverage for books, white papers, blog posts, videos, social media, whatever you want to do. And you probably have like 7 different pieces of content from this podcast episode that you'll put out in all your different channels, right? But if you look at it, a 200-page book, a 200-page novel is about 60,000 words, and a 30-minute episode is about 6,000 words. So when you have 10 30-minute episodes, you have enough content there for a 200-page book. Now, obviously, there's a lot of other things that are involved with that, but it's that much content. So like one of our clients, he's at 85 podcasts now. So 85 podcast episodes. He has about 500,000 words in his podcast. All right. The longest Harry Potter novel, which I'm still trying to get through with my 9-year-old, the longest Harry Potter novel is 250,000 words. So he's got 2 of the longest Harry Potter novels with his podcast right now. And that can be used for so many different things.
Yeah, you will become, when you host a podcast with any sort of regularity, you will become a content machine.
Yes.
A 20-minute conversation, not just, the sum total of it, but, repurposing it and doing so to as an art form, right? And it's like, okay, how many different ways, let's find all the sound bites. Let's create all the little video snippets. Let's create all of the pull quotes, audio. I mean, there's so many different things that you could do to get content for your audience. But one thing I wanted to ask you, Jason, I don't know if you have a feel for this, is with that content, obviously, if you're producing content, there's now an opportunity for SEO, and not just, your own blog post, but Here's one of the benefits of podcasting is you're not just producing stuff for YouTube, although you could if you wanted to. We'll take some of our greatest hits and put them on YouTube for sure. But when you host a podcast, you're getting backlinks from a lot of different podcast directories. Do you know much about like the SEO value of that?
Yeah, that's what I used to do before coming into podcasting was SEO. So the backlink benefit, absolutely. Getting in all those podcast directories. If you share the episodes with your guests and say, put this on your website and make sure you link back to our website, that is super helpful for you. But another thing, Josh, and you alluded to it, is Google loves fresh, unique content. And if you can put in your transcript into your website, that is a ton of content that they will eat up. And all of a sudden, you're going to be found more and more relevant for whatever particular keywords. So like one of the most downloaded episodes of Diversity Beyond the Checkbox, which is a podcast that we produce, is an episode called "What is a Virtual Privilege Walk?" And because people are looking up virtual privilege walk, and our website on that show on earfluence.com is ranking usually number 1 or number 2 on Google for that keyword. And all of a sudden, and it's because Google digs that content. It's titled well. There's a ton of content there, but that is one of the most downloaded episodes because of that SEO benefit. So yeah. And you can leverage that SEO benefit in so many different ways, Josh. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. At what point, Jason, does it make sense to work with, a podcast, a team, a production house, versus, okay, well, I'm going to, do all the editing and all that other stuff myself?
Yeah. It's about how valuable your time is. So, could you figure out how to do the podcast on your own? Sure. Like I did, you did. Like, yes, you absolutely could. But if you're going to do a 1-hour interview with somebody, let's say there's, an hour and a half of prep work before that, that's probably on the lighter side. You're going to do that hour worth of interview. And that is the high. I mean, you love that interview. And all of a sudden you're like, yes, this was amazing. I love that. And then there's like 3, 4, 5 hours worth of the editing, the mixing, maybe if you're writing an intro outro for that as well. So, could you do all that? Yes. One, you'd have to figure out how to, and then 2, how valuable is your time? Because you do have to spend a lot of time on that. But look, I mean, you mentioned Podfest, in our call prior to this, and you mentioned some of the other, podcast meetups that you'll go to. I go to some of those podcast meetups as well. And we always see these people there that are what we call pod curious, that always say, I'm thinking of starting a podcast.
Oh yeah.
And it's just like, just do it. Just press record and see what you have. This is not live. Like you can go ahead and figure out what you have. And if the first 5 episodes don't work out, don't worry about it. You will learn so much from that. And then you can be better for it and figure out if you even like podcasting. So just press record. One of my buddies who has the Pretend podcast, which is just phenomenal. It's like true crime light. It's about people pretending to be other people. He started the podcast, literally threw out the first 5 episodes because he didn't like it. And he just shifted to what it is now, which is a podcast that has over 4 million downloads and just phenomenal success from Javier. So yeah, the business case is what is your time worth? And then, do you have the expertise in doing it, or is your special power doing those other things where you need to amplify your own expertise? But if you are thinking about it, we always advise just press record and see what you have, and then come to us and we can provide advice afterwards.
Yeah, yeah. So is it what does your model look like? Do you have your pricing on your website, or maybe there's a range or kind of a ballpark? What does it cost to work with your agency or your production house?
Yeah, thank you for asking. Because it's a wide range, because we can do full service podcast production or just editing, really. So full service podcast production, and Josh, like there's so much involved in that. So like podcast concept, you need to figure out, okay, what are my goals for this podcast? Who is the audience for this podcast? Why would anybody listen to me? Like, what is my special sauce? What is my superpower there? Then you need to figure out, okay, well, how long should these episodes be? What's the right equipment for this? When am I going to record? How should I reach out to these guests? Then you're recording. Then you need to figure out what questions to ask the guests. You're recording the episodes. Then we need to edit them, mix them, figure out music for them, do the show notes, do the transcript, do all those things. So we can do any and all of that stuff. So it's a wide range as far as how companies can work with us. But I don't even want to give an exact number, because it is such a wide range. But we're always open to chatting, and we always have like a 15-minute free consult on our website if people have a podcast or have any interest at all in starting a podcast.
Yeah. All right. So your website is earfluence.com. And are there any, what types of businesses do you think that would be appropriate for a podcast? Are there any you're like, I don't know. Or is it something like, gosh, I haven't seen a case yet. That's what I'm wondering if your answer is going to be, I haven't seen a case yet where podcasting isn't a valuable tool. Because what we're talking about is, here's what we're talking about, right? We're talking about content. When is content a bad idea? And also relationships, either relationships with an audience or relationships, that you build through this incredible networking tool of podcasts. And I argue that the networking, the one-on-one that you'll build with guests and so forth, if you do it right, is particularly short-term, far more valuable than when you're just getting started out because your audience is going to be teeny tiny, and that's okay. Right. And it's totally okay. And any ideas on, like who really needs to get off their duff and get cracking?
Oh man. So every business should have a podcast. You're absolutely right. I mean, I'll give you some cases. So like, I mentioned my wife has a podcast, right? And she's now an industry expert. So she was a wedding planner. Like, why should a wedding planner have a podcast? Well, she wanted to coach other wedding planners. And now she has a membership site where she has 350 wedding planners in her group, because she has figured out how to monetize her expertise. And that all started with the podcast, right? We work with a law firm where they're telling stories from their clients about how they grew their companies, how they grew their startups, right? And so they want to attract other startups to them that are hearing their story within these podcast episodes, basically, right? We're working with anybody that wants to create that content, just as you alluded to. So the funeral home, for example. So basically, like, people look at me cross sometimes when I mention that I do a podcast for a funeral home. Well, I was driving by a cemetery one day and said, every single one of those headstones is a story that needs to be told. How do I do that? Well, I gave the podcast concept talked over with a funeral home and said, look, what if when somebody comes, has a family member that has passed on, that you offer them a chance to do something that goes beyond the obituary. That's so much more than that one-page obituary. That's an audio recording of stories that the family remembers about this person that are, kind of in the moment, right? And so they love that. And so now that funeral home is the funeral home in the area where, if the family wanted to tell stories and go way beyond what they get in a one-page obituary, they can do that through this podcast. So that becomes valuable to them as a market. I mean, they're a family company and they want to do right by the community first and foremost, but it is also marketing for them, is a way for them to be like, oh, I want to go to this funeral home because this is a funeral home that has this podcast. So if a funeral home can do it, any business should.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, listen, this has been fantastic. Jason Gillikin, founder, CEO of Earfluence. Are you going to any podcasting conferences in the future?
We will. We need to figure that out exactly, but I will certainly meet up with you.
Yeah, Nashville's not too far away for Podcast Movement in August. So yeah, fantastic. All right, Jason Gillikin, earfluence.com. Thank you so much for joining us.
Josh, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the time.